In 1991, the Chilean economist Manfred Max-Neef wrote a very interesting book called Human Scale Development, and it's particularly known for this grid, which we'll get to in a little bit. Now, this is a book of economics, and usually I don't do a ton on economics on this channel, but I think this book has wide relevance. It's very interdisciplinary, and so let's say that you're interested in eco-criticism or something like that, sustainable development, things of that nature. You will find lots to think about in this book. So I'm going to tackle it here and try to shed some light on it. Now, Max-Neef argues that if we want a society where there is flourishing, where things go well, then we need three things. We need to think about needs. Okay, so needs plus their satisfiers. What are the things that make us happy in relation to our needs? We also need self-reliance. We need to be able to have an economy where people are not always dependent on the outside world. And we need an economy that he calls articulated. So an articulated economy. And I'll talk about this one later because it's a bit ambiguous at this point what articulated means, but we'll see in context later what that refers to. So let's start with this grid then. And as you look at this, you can see that on the left here, we have 9 different needs. And then we also have 36 different satisfiers, all the way from 1 to 36. I've put a few examples in here. I've copied Max-Neef's examples, but he has quite a few more. Just for the sake of brevity, I didn't want each box to be humongous. But this just gives you a little bit of an indication of how each box can have multiple satisfiers that meet a particular need. So let's think about these needs a little bit. We have subsistence, we need the basic goods of life, protection, we have to feel safe, affection, love, understanding, we want to understand the world. Participation, we're social creatures, we don't just want to live in isolation. Surprisingly, we also have idleness, so we need time to rest and to think and to recharge and so on. Creativity, we want to do things. Identity, we need to know who we are. And finally, freedom. If we live under an oppressive government, it's not going to be very easy to make sure that our needs are met. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, okay, well, are these needs to be met in a certain order? And Max-Neef says there is a certain minimum threshold for all these needs, like I need to have some food and clothing and shelter and so on. But beyond that, they're not linear. It's not like you need protection before you can get affection or something like that. You can work on all these different needs at the same time. We then have 4 different columns to organize our satisfiers. And we start with being. Being refers to our basic existence. This is who we are as human beings. We are creatures that are physical and mental. We, for instance, as I said before, we need solidarity. We can't just live in isolation. We are rational creatures and so on. So this really refers to our being, our basic existence. Having next is about possessing things. These are things that we might have. So we have food, shelter, healthcare, and so on. We also have games, let's say, peace of mind, all kinds of things that we can possess that are going to contribute to our being and are going to shape us. Then we have doing, and if having is mostly nouns, here we have mostly verbs. These are different actions that can be taken to address our needs. So for instance, for understanding, we can investigate, study, meditate, and so on. And then finally, interacting, this is a bit of a tricky one. This refers to space and time, which in the German is befinden. It's kind of like where you find yourself. So this is the space and the time that allows for all the other things to actually happen. So we have, for instance, for affection, we need privacy, we need a home. These are the spaces that allow us to be affectionate. Next, what we can say is that if these needs are not met, then we end up with poverty. So poverty is a major concern, and poverty should be very broadly understood. So it's not just financial poverty. It can also be, for instance, poverty of understanding or a lack of health care, and so on and so forth. This kind of poverty often leads to pathologies. And these are not just individual pathologies, but also social ones. For example, on the individual level, if I lose my job and my needs are not met, then this can lead to problems. Let's say I become abusive towards my spouse because I'm so frustrated. That would be terrible, but it could happen. On the social level, we see other pathologies as well, and Max-Neef points to 4 different types of pathologies. Some of them have to do with euphemisms and ideological manipulation. In a society where needs are not met, those in charge, those who have power, can easily manipulate others. The second pathology would be violence. This is where things really go badly. The third is isolation or exile, or just not feeling like you're part of the whole. You feel marginalized. And the last is a thwarting of life projects. If I want to tackle something and use my talents for the good, but I can't even feed my family, then I'm not going to be able to do this. So far, looking at this grid, we've looked mostly at positive satisfiers, but Max-Neef points out that we can also think of other ways to classify these satisfiers. One way is to think of really negative ones, and he calls these destroyers. So destroyers, these kind of look like satisfiers at first, but they are actually very bad. If we think of censorship, we could say, well, censorship makes some people feel protected. But, of course, censorship also destroys society. Another example would be an arms race. If the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War are having an arms race, that makes people in each society maybe feel better about themselves, and they think, oh, I have freedom here, or I'm protected, I'm affectionate towards my own society. But of course, an arms race is ultimately destructive for everybody. We also have what are called pseudo-satisfiers. So pseudo means kind of false or fake. And pseudo-satisfiers, these look promising. They look like they make us happy, but they also fall short, but not quite as badly as destroyers. For example, if we have something like prostitution, prostitution looks like it's going to give me affection, but we know that there are all these negative side effects. Another example would be chauvinistic nationalism. If you are really nationalistic and you think my country is everything and I'm willing to fight for it and so on, patriotism, of course, is good, but when it becomes too extreme, when I hate foreigners and immigrants and people like that, then this is going to be a problem because I'm going to limit their freedom and I'm going to maximize mine. A surprising one in this category is charity. So Max-Neef suggests that charity can be very good, but you can also inhibit people from being creative themselves or from really developing their own identity. Then we have what are called inhibiting satisfiers. Inhibiting satisfiers. These prevent people from really developing themselves. They're not as bad as pseudo-satisfiers or destroyers, but an example would be something like an overprotective family. They love you very much, but they're also preventing you from doing certain things. There are 2 more satisfiers that Max-Neef mentions here, and these are almost a different category, I would say. So the first is singular satisfiers, and the second one is synergic, or however you want to say this. It's like synergy, so synergic satisfiers. Singular satisfiers, they basically just satisfy one thing, and it can be very positive. Let's say that the state starts a housing program. Well, my housing needs are being met here. Although I think we could also say, well, housing gives me a sense of identity and other things too. But Max-Neef gives this as an example of a primarily singular satisfier. And singular ones tend to come from the top down. They come from the state, let's say, or from some organization. Synergic satisfiers, on the other hand, satisfy multiple needs at the same time. If you do meditation, as an example, you can feel creative, you can enjoy your idleness, you can participate with others if you do it socially, you can develop your identity, you can feel affectionate because you're in touch with your sensuality, and so on and so forth. Another one of his favorite examples is breastfeeding, which does a lot of these similar things. Okay, so at this point then, I think we have a pretty good sense of the basics here of how the grid works. And if you want to use the grid yourself, what you can do is you basically just leave boxes 1 to 36 empty. You give the grid to a group and you say, go to town, describe your society, talk about your needs, and you can put in both negative and positive things, and we'll get a pretty good, accurate picture here of how you feel about how needs are being met in your society. As you recall, earlier I mentioned that we need 3 things for human flourishing, right? So needs and satisfiers, self-reliance, and an articulated economy. And I'm going to talk more about the second needs or criteria at this point. So we need to understand the context now. How does Max-Neef relate this to economic development? And the way in which he looks at the economy is to really split it into 2 levels. On the one hand, we have what he calls the macro level. Think of macroeconomics. This is the big picture. And then on the other hand, we have the micro level. The micro level. This is the local level. This is where you have local businesses, or what he likes to call micro-organizations. So micro-organizations. Oops. Not a huge state-sponsored organization, but something really small. Like, let's say that I start a local group for teaching immigrants the local language, and I'm volunteering, and maybe we hire 1 person for it. So if I'm doing that, that's sort of a micro-organization. It uses a lot of volunteer labor. Maybe there's another one down the road that is an actual business. You know, somebody starts up some small organization to do something. That's what Max-Neef is talking about. This is really the grassroots level, as he likes to call it. Another term that applies to the micro level is what he calls the invisible world. So the invisible world. Often when economists talk about a country or society, they can't quite map everything that's happening at the ground level. So let's say that you're an economist and you're like, okay, I'm going to try to figure out how many people are in the workforce, what jobs are they doing, and so on. What you don't realize is that many people are working on the side, on the black market. They don't declare their income. Some people might be like, okay, I'm going to do an extra job on Saturdays and make some extra money. All of that is invisible, right? You're not actually charting any of this. And of course, in some societies, the invisible world is much bigger than in other societies. And then one more term here that's interesting. This is non-conventional resources. Non-conventional resources. So if you remember earlier, I said I'm starting my society or organization to help newcomers learn the language. Well, we're developing skills by doing that. I might just be volunteering, but I'm developing communication skills and other things. And these are, again, not picked up by economists very easily, but they are non-conventional resources that are of value and that speak to the whole person. So not just to the person as measured in economic terms. The problem, as Max-Neef points out or argues, is that economists almost exclusively these days tend to focus on macroeconomics. They love the big picture. And he gives quite a few examples, but I'm just going to focus on a couple here. So one big economic theory that's sometimes used to solve all problems is what he refers to as monetarist neoliberalism. And I'm going to use a different color here. We'll actually just use this color here, monetarist. There you go. I was going to use green, but green sounds like it's good, and we need this to be bad. On the other hand, if I use red, you won't be able to read it against the black. So there we go. Monetarist neoliberalism. What does that mean? Well, monetarism is the idea that you can control inflation in the economy, right? There's too much money in the economy and things are getting too expensive. And you can control this by limiting or controlling the money supply. The government prints less money, you spend less, and all of a sudden inflation comes under control. This is more of a right-wing idea, and it's especially associated with people like Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys. And I'm not going to get into that too much here, but that's the background here. Neoliberalism, the way to think about the second term, is that we're talking especially about open markets and capitalism. So we want lots of privatization of companies, right? The state shouldn't own things. We want deregulation. We want the government out of the market, essentially. And when you combine these two things, you get a fairly unregulated capitalist economy. The reason that Max-Neef likes to use this term is, as we said before, he's Chilean. And if you think about Chile during this period, this is the time of the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And Pinochet put all these things into practice. So between 1973 and 1990, there we go, Pinochet is experimenting with monetarist neoliberalism. In some ways it works, but in other ways it creates all kinds of problems. So even though, let's say, the economy is doing okay, and this can be argued about, of course, I'm not going to get into those details, there is, according to Max-Neef, a lot more inequality. In other words, yes, maybe some of the rich people get richer, but the poor get poorer. And the benefits are especially at the top. So this is where the benefits are, and the people at the bottom, they suffer. So that's one example of a big economic theory being applied from the top down, right? Everything is top down, and that's not a good thing. Another example here would be Keynesian economics. So Keynesian, there we go, Keynesian economics. This is a more socialist way of looking at things, typically, I would say. And the idea is basically that when you have a recession, things are bad, you spend more if you're in government. And then if things are good, if you're in good times, then the government is supposed to save money and pay back the debt. And we know from Keynesian economics that doesn't always work because governments often spend more than they actually save. In good times, they're like, oh, we've got lots of money now, but we're not going to save it. So Keynesian economics, again, tends to be focused on the whole economy, on the big picture, and not necessarily on the micro. So what economists keep doing then is they keep focusing on things like GDP. So what is the GDP of a country? And if it's a high GDP, then it must be successful. And that's not looking at human needs. If my country makes lots of money, but I'm deeply unhappy, that's not necessarily for the greatest good of all. Okay, so we've really seen the negative side here then. And I should just mention one more thing before we look at the positive side. So if we can really meet human needs in a better way. And the last thing I need to mention here, which I'd forgotten about, is that there's one more term. This is what he refers to as co-optation. So imagine that you are developing a society from the top down, and you go, okay, I'm going to sponsor this particular project. Yes, it's at the grassroots level. Let's donate some money. As the state, we will make sure that we develop society. But then after a while, the bureaucrats start to run the program, and you kind of tout it as, here's a successful thing that the state has done. And eventually, the state itself, right, because we should think of the state as kind of part of the top level here, the state takes credit, the local level doesn't matter, and we have what's called co-optation. So we go down, we do some kind of project, but then it becomes bureaucratized and taken over. So this is co-optation. Co-optation. There we go. What we need instead is we need articulation. So articulation means that the two levels are in harmony. Articulation. We both respect the micro. We allow people to be resourceful and self-reliant. And yes, we do invest in them to some extent. We also know that we need the state. We need global actors. We can't just have our society by itself. But we also recognize that these things need to be in harmony and in balance, and one can't take over the other one. So what does an articulated economy look like? Well, one of the key features is what Max-Neef refers to as participatory democracy. Participatory democracy. We need to be involved. We should vote, and then we should vote regularly. and keep our politicians accountable, right? So everything is from the bottom up. We also need to make sure that needs are satisfied, as we said before, and we need to look at the whole person, not just the person as in a sort of instrumental fashion. So if we're going to look at this whole person, we need to start with the person, him or herself, and he refers to this as the Eigenwelt, German word here, or two words stuck together. Welt means world, and Eigen is like your own world, but you're not just some kind of atom by itself. You're part of a larger whole. So you need to think of yourself in relation to the Mitwelt, okay, which is the social group. This is the world around you. And then finally, we have what he refers to as the Umwelt. There we go. And the Umwelt is the environment. This is where ecology comes in. You need to make sure that you care about nature and ensure that you don't destroy nature just to have a higher GDP. Okay, I was going to do all of this in green to show that this is what we want, but you'll just have to remember that. Maybe one more quick term here. Another thing that he likes is what he refers to as barefoot banking. Barefoot banking. And he wrote an entire different book about barefoot economics, which you can look up if you like. Barefoot banking is really the idea that you need to invest in very small businesses and then allow them to succeed. And this is like micro-investing in a sense. So this is another aspect of this better articulated economy. When we do these things, when we start with the micro and try to address people's needs in holistic ways at the grassroots level, allowing them to be self-reliant, allowing them to have to make up their own mind, to invest, to develop their skills, their non-conventional resources, and so on and so forth, what we are doing is we're making sure that our plan is endogenous. So endogenous means coming from within. And what we don't want is we don't want something that is exogenous. So if it's coming from the top down, then this would be exogenous. It's coming from the outside, right? X is out of, so exogenous. That's not something that we want. We want this exogenous approach. Okay, so hopefully at this point gives you a pretty good sense of what Max-Neef is saying in this book. Just going to go back up here to our index. And the last thing I would suggest is that you don't just take this all for granted, but you think about it carefully yourself. And maybe you find ways to even redo the grid or add things to it. One of the things I thought was whether maybe language should be added here. Is language a human need? Or is it a satisfier that satisfies a number of different needs? So that was just one thought I had, but I'm sure you can come up with ideas as well. And in doing so, you'll be able to think about how can you make a society flourish, how can you make it better, and how can you relate all of this to economics.